The neural implant behind Kira Voss's left ear sparked violently. As the hegemony overseer's shock rod connected with her skull, blood trickled down her neck, mixing with the sweat and grime that had become her second skin during 18 months of captivity aboard the Crimson Harvest. Pathetic human filth, spat Warlord Rickstack, his mandibles clicking in disgust. The towering Vorthik stood nearly 3 meters tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the cargo bay. Your species disappoints even our lowest expectations. Kira remained on her knees, hands zip-tied behind her back, but her dark eyes burned with an intensity that made several of the alien guards shift uncomfortable. Why? She had learned their language during the long journey. From Earth's shattered colonies, learned it well enough to understand every insult, every casual discussion of her eventual fate. The arena fights on Gorvik Prime were legendary throughout. The hegemony. 23 species contributed their greatest warriors to the blood sport that entertained trillions across the galaxy. Humans had never been invited to participate. They were considered too weak, too fragile, too unremarkable to provide adequate entertainment. That changed when the hegemony annexed the Kepler 440 to system. Tomorrow you will enter the Crimson Circle, Rickstack continued, circling her like a predator, sizing up wounded prey. The audience expects spectacle, not sport. You will die quickly and pathetically, as befits your kind. What the Warlord didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Dr. Kira Voss had been the lead xenobiology researcher at the Kepler Research Station. For 7 years, she had studied every piece of alien physiology, every scrap of biological data the United Earth Defense Force had collected through espionage and battlefield recovery. She knew their weaknesses better than they knew themselves. More importantly, she had spent the last 18 months observing, learning, and planning. The cargo bay housed nearly 200 captured humans from a dozen different worlds. Most were colonists, farmers, engineers, people who had never held a weapon in anger. But scattered among them were soldiers, mercenaries, and survivors of the Outer Rim conflicts. They had been keeping their heads down, following Kira's strict instructions to appear broken and harmless. As the guards herded them toward the holding cells, Kira caught the eye of Marcus Way, a former United Earth Marine whose entire battalion had been captured defending New Shanghai. He gave an almost imperceptible nod. The message was clear. They were ready. The hegemony had made a critical error in their assessment of humanity. They saw individual weakness and assumed collective frailty. They observed primitive technology and concluded inferior intelligence. They witnessed emotional responses and mistook them for mental instability. They had never encountered a species that turned desperation into innovation, that transformed suffering into rage, that treated impossible odds as merely another problem to solve. In her cell that night, Kira stared through the small porthole at the gas giant Gorvik, its storm-racked surface illuminated by 3 moons. Somewhere on that world below, in an arena designed to showcase the galaxy's most brutal entertainment, she would either prove humanity's worth or die trying. The neural implant behind her ear had been damaged by the overseer's shock rod, causing intermittent static and blinding pain. But it also meant the hegemony's behavioral monitoring system could no longer track her stress levels or emotional state. For the first time in 18 months, her thoughts were completely her own. She smiled in the darkness, and it was not a pleasant expression. By tomorrow night, the galaxy would learn that humans were not weak. They were not pathetic. They were not broken. They were absolutely, unquestionably, and terrifyingly human. The shuttle descent to Gorvik Prime felt like riding a meteor through hell. The massive gas giant's gravity well created atmospheric conditions that would have terrified most species, but Kira pressed her face against the reinforced viewport, memorizing every detail of the approach vector. Information was ammunition, and she intended to be well armed. The Crimson Arena rose from the planet's surface like a metallic volcano, its tiered structure capable of holding 3 million spectators from across the galaxy. Energy shields flickered across its surface, protecting the audience from the planet's toxic atmosphere while allowing perfect visibility of the carnage within. Beautiful, isn't it? Rikstak's translator made his clicking mandibles sound almost musical. 23 species have contributed their finest warriors to these sacred games. Tomorrow, you will join the ranks of the honored dead. The irony wasn't lost on Kira. The hegemony treated their arena deaths as honor, something to be celebrated and remembered. They had no concept of what humanity called a Pyrrhic victory. The holding facilities beneath the arena were a maze of species-specific environments. The Vorthic warriors preferred high humidity and dim lighting. The crystalline Nexari required precise electromagnetic fields. The predatory Olmuth needed live prey. To maintain their aggression levels, each species had been carefully studied and accommodated. Humans got a concrete box with protein paste and recycled water. Your first opponent will be Kreshtar of the Blood Moon clan, announced Arena Master Vex Dan, a corpulent hegemony official whose translation implant gave his voice an oily quality. He has killed 47 opponents across 6 systems. Consider it an honor that your death will add to his legend. Through the energy barrier separating herself from the preparation chamber, Kira could see Kreshtar. The Vorthic warrior stood nearly 4 meters tall, his natural exoskeleton enhanced with ceremonial bone spikes and razor-sharp chitin blades. Neural enhancement ports dotted his head, connected to cables that fed combat stimulants directly into his nervous system. What the arena master didn't know was that Kira had been studying Vorthic anatomy since her graduate school days. Their exoskeleton, while nearly impenetrable from the front, had microscopic stress fractures along the dorsal joints, a evolutionary remnant from when their species was prey rather than predator. More importantly, their enhanced nervous systems created a dependency on the combat stimulants, cut the supply, and they experienced massive. The arena floor was a work of art designed for maximum brutality. Variable gravity fields, environmental hazards, and trap systems could be activated to enhance the entertainment value. Weapon caches were scattered strategically around the perimeter, though most contained equipment designed for specific alien physiologies. As the countdown to her first match began, Kira closed her eyes and ran through every piece of intelligence she had gathered. Kreshtar would come at her fast and aggressive, relying on his size and enhancement systems to overwhelm her before she could adapt. The crowd would expect her to run, to cower, to die beautifully. They were going to be disappointed. The arena gates slid open with a rumble that shook the entire structure. Artificial sunlight flooded the combat floor as 3 million alien voices rose in a deafening cheer. Kira walked into the light wearing nothing but basic combat fatigues and boots, her slight frame dwarfed by the massive space around her. Kreshtar emerged from the opposite gate, his war cry amplified by speakers throughout the arena. He began his ritual combat dance, designed to intimidate opponents and whip the crowd into a frenzy. The Vorthic way of war was all about psychological dominance through displays of overwhelming force. Kira stood perfectly still in the center of the arena, watching. "Look at her," roared the announcer. "The human shows no fear. Perhaps their species possesses more courage than intelligence." The crowd's laughter was like thunder, rolling across the arena in waves. They found her stillness amusing rather than threatening. A small, fragile human facing a legendary Vorthic warrior. It was comedy, not combat. Kreshtar completed his ritual and fixed his compound eyes on Kira. The neural enhancers pumped combat stimulants through his system, increasing his reaction time and pain tolerance to superhuman levels. He lowered his massive frame into a charge position, razor-sharp limbs extending like natural weapons. "Fight!" bellowed Arena Master Vex Dan. Kreshtar launched himself across the arena floor, with frightening speed, his enhanced reflexes turning him into a blur of deadly motion. The crowd rose to their feet, anticipating the quick, brutal end to what had been an amusing curiosity. Kira waited until the last possible second, then dove directly toward him. The collision should have pulverized every bone in Kira's body. Instead, she slid beneath Kreshtar's primary striking limbs and drove her shoulder into the microscopic stress fracture she had identified along his left dorsal joint. The impact sent a hairline crack racing through his exoskeleton, invisible to the crowd but devastating to his structural integrity. Kreshtar's momentum carried him past her, confusion evident in his compound eyes. No opponent had ever moved toward him during his opening charge. The combat stimulants flooding his system demanded aggressive action, but his tactical processors couldn't compute this unprecedented response. Kira rolled to her feet and sprinted toward the nearest weapon cache, knowing she had perhaps 10 seconds before the Vorthok warrior's enhanced reflexes adapted to her strategy. Behind her, she could hear his limbs scraping against the arena floor as he pivoted for another attack. The weapon cache was designed for Nexari physiology crystalline matrices that interface directly with their silicon-based nervous systems. Useless to most species, but Kira had studied their energy patterns during her xenobiology research. She grabbed two of the crystal weapons and slammed them together at precisely the right frequency. The resulting harmonic resonance was inaudible to most of the alien audience, but it sent violent tremors through the arena's structural supports. More importantly, it interfered with the neural enhancement ports feeding combat stimulants to Kreshtar's system. The Vorthok warrior stumbled mid-charge, his enhanced reflexes suddenly sluggish as the chemical dependency created by months of stimulant use crashed into brutal withdrawal. The crowd's cheers turned to confused murmurs as their champion warrior swayed on his feet. Like a drunk. Impossible, snarled Arena Master Vex Dan into his communications ray. Check the enhancement systems. Something is interfering with the neural feeds. Kira dropped the crystal weapons and grabbed a hegemony plasma rifle from another cache. The weapon was nearly as long as she was tall, designed for the average 3-meter hegemony soldier. But she had spent 18 months studying their technology. She knew exactly how to override the biometric locks. The plasma bolt caught Kreshtar's center mass, punching through his compromised exoskeleton like tissue paper. The legendary warrior toppled backward, ichor spraying from the massive wound in his chest. His death throes lasted nearly 30 seconds, long enough for 3 million alien spectators to sit in stunned silence. Then the arena exploded in chaos. Fraud, screamed a Vorthok noble in the premium seating section. The human used forbidden techniques. This match is invalid. The equipment was standard issue, roared back a hegemony administrator. The combat was legal under arena rules. Accusations flew between species representatives as betting syndicates realized they faced massive losses. The crowd had placed overwhelming odds against the human, expecting an amusing execution rather than legitimate combat. Now trillions of credits hung in the balance. In the midst of the political turmoil, Few noticed Arena Master Vex Dan speaking urgently into his private communications channel. Yes, Warlord Rickstack, I understand. Release all of them, sir. That's 23 opponents. Yes, sir. The spectacle must be maintained. Down on the arena floor, Kira had claimed Kreshtar's ceremonial bone spikes as trophies not out of bloodlust, but because their unique composition could be fashioned into tools. She was already planning her next moves when the announcement echoed across the arena. Citizens of the hegemony, we have decided to honor this human's unexpected victory with a special exhibition. Tomorrow, she will face not one opponent, but all 23 champions simultaneously. The crowd's roar was deafening, their earlier confusion transformed into bloodthirsty anticipation. No gladiator in arena history had ever faced more than 5 opponents at once. 23 was execution disguised as entertainment. But as Kira looked up at the viewing boxes where hegemony officials congratulated themselves on solving their political problem, she smiled. They still didn't understand what they were dealing with. Humans didn't just adapt to impossible odds, they embraced them. That night, in her concrete cell, she used Kreshtar's bone spikes to carve detailed anatomical diagrams into the walls. Each of the 23 species had exploitable weaknesses, and she had 18 hours to memorize them all. Her damaged neural implant sparked with increasing frequency, sending lightning bolts of pain through her skull. But the malfunction also meant the hegemony couldn't monitor her preparation. She thought about the 200 humans still trapped aboard the Crimson Harvest, waiting for word that would never come. She thought about the colonies that had burned while she was captured, the millions of humans dead or enslaved throughout hegemony space. Tomorrow's match wasn't about survival anymore. It was about sending a message that would echo across the galaxy. Humanity would not go quietly into extinction. They would make their enemies pay for every life taken, every world burned, every child enslaved. The arena wanted a spectacle. She would give them one they would never forget. The arena's preparation chambers had been retrofitted overnight to accommodate 23 different species, creating a cacophony of alien roars, clicks, and harmonic vibrations that penetrated even the reinforced walls. Kira sat in her concrete cell, listening to the symphony of violence being prepared for her execution. Arena Master Vex Dan appeared at her energy barrier, flanked by a full squad of hegemony guards. His earlier oily confidence had been replaced by nervous energy, and she could see sweat glistening on his pale skin despite the climate controls. "The betting odds are now 14,000 to 1 against you," he said, his translator struggling with the tremor in his voice. "Some syndicates are offering complete planetary systems as stakes. Your continued existence has become problematic." "Then, perhaps you should have killed me quietly in my cell," Kira replied, her voice steady despite the agony from her malfunctioning neural implant. "Too late now." 3 million spectators. What Vex Dan didn't know was that Kira had spent the night doing more than studying anatomy charts. The bone spikes from crushed RS corpse had been carved into tools with very specific purposes, and the concrete dust from her cell walls had been carefully collected and processed using techniques learned during her xenobiology research. The arena floor had been reconfigured into a maze-like structure, designed to prevent any single combatant from being overwhelmed too quickly. Multiple levels, environmental hazards, and weapon caches created opportunities for tactical maneuvering, assuming the fighter was skilled enough to exploit them. As the gates opened and Kira stepped into the blazing artificial sunlight, the crowd's roar was like a physical force. 3 million voices screaming for blood created sound waves that rattled her teeth and made her damaged implant spark violently. She ignored the pain and focused on the tactical situation. 23 gates around the arena's perimeter began opening simultaneously. The champions emerged like nightmares made flesh, the crystalline Nexari crackling with electrical discharge, the insectoid Threx warriors clicking their razor mandibles, the massive Gornaki with their stone-like hide and crushing limbs. Each species had been selected to represent different combat philosophies: speed versus strength, stealth versus aggression, technology versus natural weapons. Together, they represented the pinnacle of galactic military evolution against one small human who shouldn't have survived her first match. "Citizens of the hegemony," bellowed the announcer, "witness the execution of the human pretender. No warrior has ever faced 23 champions and lived to tell of it." The crowd's anticipation was electric as the champions began their approach, some charging directly while others moved to flanking positions. The Nexari began channeling energy for long-range attacks, while the Threx scattered to use their natural stealth abilities. Kira sprinted toward the central structure, a multi-level platform with multiple weapon caches and environmental controls. But instead of climbing up for defensive advantage, she dove beneath it and began working with the bone tools she had prepared. The concrete dust she had collected wasn't random debris. It was a carefully planned chemical reaction waiting to happen, mixed with her own blood and introduced to the arena's atmospheric processors. It would create a toxic fog that would affect each species differently, based on their unique respiratory systems. The first champion to reach her position was Velthok. Of the Threx, his natural camouflage making him nearly invisible until he struck. His razor mandibles slashed through the space where her head had been a microsecond earlier, missing by millimeters as she rolled aside. But Kira had been expecting him. The Threx relied on ambush tactics, which meant they had to get close. She drove one of her improvised bone blades directly into the soft joint between his head and thorax, severing the neural cluster that controlled his camouflage systems. Velthok's death scream was amplified by his natural acoustics, creating a sound that temporarily stunned several of the approaching champions. But more importantly, his ichor contained pheromones that would trigger aggressive responses in 3 other species, turning potential allies into enemies. The chemical reaction was beginning to take effect as the toxic fog spread through the arenas. Lower levels. The crowd couldn't see it clearly, but the champions were beginning to show signs of respiratory distress. Different species were affected at different rates, creating chaos in their coordinated assault. "What is that substance?" demanded Warlord Rickstack from the premium viewing section. "Scan the atmospheric composition immediately." But the arena's sensors had been designed to monitor for weapons and energy signatures, not chemical warfare. By the time they identified the threat, the toxic fog had reached sufficient concentration to begin affecting combat performance. Across multiple species, a massive Gornaki warrior named Thokmer reached Kira's position, his stone-like hide protecting him from the toxic effects. He swung his crushing limbs with enough force to pulverize a small building. But Kira had studied Gornaki anatomy extensively. Their incredible strength came from a hydraulic system, based on internal pressure puncture the right spot, and they became helpless. She waited until his massive fist committed to a crushing blow, then drove her improvised weapon into the pressure release valve hidden beneath his armpit. The Gornaki's roar of pain echoed throughout the arena as his left arm deflated, like a punctured balloon, to down, 21 to go. The crowd was no longer cheering with anticipation. They were screaming with bloodlust as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in arena history. The human wasn't just surviving, she was systematically dismantling champions who had never known defeat. But Kira knew her advantages were temporary. The toxic fog would dissipate, her improvised weapons would break, and eventually the sheer number of opponents would overwhelm her. She needed to change the tactical situation completely. It was time to turn the arena itself into a weapon. Kira's fingers flew across the environmental control panel. She had accessed beneath the central platform, her xenobiology training paying dividends as she rapidly reconfigured the arena's atmospheric processors. The toxic fog was only the beginning. Now she was going to turn the hegemony's own technology against their champions. The first modification activated the variable gravity fields in a sequence that would create gravitational shears between different sections of the arena floor. Species adapted to different gravity wells would find themselves suddenly fighting, not just each other, but the environment itself. A pack of 3 Ulmuth hunters had been circling her position, their predatory instincts making them coordinate, like a wolf pack. But as the gravity fields shifted beneath them, their perfectly synchronized movements became a deadly liability. The lead hunter found himself in 0.3 while his packmates struggled into 0.8, turning their coordinated assault into a flailing disaster. Kira emerged from beneath the platform with a hegemony plasma cannon, not the infantry weapon she had used against Kreshtar, but a full crew-served weapon designed for ship-to-ship combat. It should have been impossible for a human to lift, much less aim accurately. But the shifting gravity fields were working in her favor. The plasma bolt vaporized all 3 Ulmuth hunters simultaneously. Their predatory screams cut short as superheated energy turned them into expanding clouds of ionized particles. The crowd's bloodthirsty cheers faltered as they realized the impossible was happening. The human was winning. "Impossible," roared Warlord Rickstack, his mandibles clicking frantically. 23 champions cannot be defeated by a single inferior creature. This is some form of technology. But Arena Master Vex Dan was studying his instrument readings with growing horror. "Sir, she's not using any prohibited technology. Everything she's doing is within arena regulations. She's just using our own systems against us." The gravitational chaos had divided the remaining 18 champions into smaller groups, each struggling with different environmental conditions. The crystalline Nexari found their electrical systems malfunctioning in the high-gravity zones, while the gas-breathing Vorthik were suffocating in the low-pressure areas. Kira abandoned the heavy plasma cannon and grabbed a weapon cache designed for the insectoid clef, vibro blades that could cut through virtually any material by oscillating at the molecular level. But instead of using them as handheld weapons, she began systematically sabotaging the arena's structural supports. Each cut was precisely calculated. Based on her knowledge of alien engineering principles, the hegemony built their structures to withstand external attacks, not internal sabotage by someone who understood their mathematical foundations. The platform she had been hiding beneath suddenly tilted at a 45-degree angle, sending Dthrek's warriors sliding into a group of Nexari. The resulting collision created an electrical discharge that would have powered a small city, but it also triggered a cascade failure in the arena's energy systems. Emergency lighting bathed everything in crimson as primary power fluctuated. The crowd's cheers turned to nervous murmurs as they realized the arena itself was becoming unstable. A massive hegemony champion named Drakethal, augmented with cybernetic implants and wielding energy weapons that could level city blocks, finally reached Kira's position. His enhanced reflexes should have made him impossible to defeat in direct combat, but she wasn't planning to fight fair. As Drakethal raised his energy cannon for a killing shot, Kira triggered the final sequence she had programmed into the environmental controls. The arena's atmospheric processors, already compromised by her chemical warfare, began cycling through every possible environmental configuration simultaneously. The result was apocalyptic. Sections of the arena floor became pools of liquid nitrogen, while others reached temperatures that melted metal. Oxygen concentrations varied wildly between zones, creating spontaneous fires and suffocating voids. The artificial gravity fluctuated between crushing weight and weightless chaos. Drakethal's cybernetic systems, designed to function in stable environments, began experiencing cascading failures as they tried to adapt to the rapidly changing conditions. His enhanced reflexes became liabilities as they overcompensated for environmental factors that changed faster than his processors could calculate. Kira used a cleft vibro blade to sever the power cables feeding his cybernetic systems, then watched as the hegemony's greatest augmented warrior collapsed like a broken puppet. His death was not heroic or glorious. It was the inevitable result of over-reliance on technology in an environment designed by someone who understood that technology's weaknesses. The arena floor was now a hellscape of environmental extremes, structural collapse, and the corpses of champions who had been considered invincible. Of the original 23, only 7 remained alive, and they were scattered across different sections, unable to coordinate their attacks. But the environmental chaos was affecting Kira as well. Her damaged neural implant was sparking constantly, sending waves of agony through her skull with each electromagnetic fluctuation. Blood streamed from her nose and ears as the implant's malfunction began causing neurological damage. She had perhaps minutes before her nervous system shut down completely, but she could see the terror in the remaining champions' eyes as they realized what she had accomplished. They weren't fighting a warrior anymore, they were facing a force of nature that had turned their own arena into a weapon of mass destruction. The crowd had fallen silent, 3 million alien voices stilled by the unprecedented carnage unfolding before them. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a demonstration of something they had never encountered before. Human ingenuity weaponized by desperation and refined by scientific knowledge. 7 champions remained. 7 chances for the hegemony to salvage some semblance of their superiority. 7 obstacles between Kira and a victory that would echo across the galaxy. She smiled through the blood streaming down her face and prepared for the final phase of her plan. The arena's structural integrity was failing rapidly, as Kira's systematic sabotage created cascading collapses throughout the massive complex. Emergency klaxons wailed as sections of the upper tiers began to buckle, sending streams of debris raining down onto the combat floor. The 7 remaining champions found themselves fighting not just a human, but an environment that had become actively hostile to their survival. Warlord Rikstak stood in his premium viewing box, watching his carefully orchestrated execution transform into a nightmare that defied every assumption about human capabilities. "Evacuate the arena," he commanded, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "If that creature survives, our entire species hierarchy will be questioned, sir." Arena Master Vex Dan replied, his translator struggling with his panicked breathing. "The evacuation protocols will take 47 minutes. The match will be concluded long before then." Down on the combat floor, Kira was experiencing the full effects of her damaged neural implant's cascade failure. Each electromagnetic pulse from the arena's failing systems sent violent seizures through her nervous system. But the malfunctions also meant she was completely invisible to hegemony monitoring equipment. Her brain patterns, stress hormones, and tactical assessments were hidden behind a wall of static that grew thicker with each passing moment. The remaining champions had adapted to the environmental chaos with varying degrees of success. 3. Nexari had linked their crystalline matrices to create a stable energy field, while 2 Threx were using their natural agility to navigate the unstable terrain. A lone Gornaki warrior and a heavily augmented hegemony soldier completed the group that now converged on her position. Kira's vision was blurred by blood and neurological interference, but her hands moved with practiced precision as she assembled her final weapon from components scattered throughout the arena: hegemony power cells, Nexari resonance crystals, Threx biotoxins, and structural elements from the arena itself, all combined into a device that would have been impossible to create under normal circumstances. She's building something, observed the lead Nexari through harmonic vibrations that translated into precise mathematical concepts. The energy signature is unlike any recorded technology. The augmented hegemony soldier, designation ZK7749, activated his tactical analysis systems and immediately transmitted a priority alert to Command Authority. Unknown human deploying improvised technological synthesis. Recommend immediate orbital bombardment to prevent tactical contamination. But orbital weapons required time to acquire targets and penetrate planetary defenses. Time that was running out as rapidly as Kira's deteriorating neurological. She triggered her improvised device just as the 7 champions reached optimal striking distance. The result was not an explosion, but something far more devastating: a harmonically tuned electromagnetic pulse that interfaced directly with each species' nervous system using their own biological frequencies against them. The Nexari's crystalline matrices shattered like glass as harmonic resonance tore through their silicon-based consciousness. The Threx warriors collapsed as their exoskeletons became conductors for electrical discharge that overloaded their primitive nervous systems. The Gornaki's hydraulic biology seized as electromagnetic interference disrupted the pressure systems that powered his movement. ZK7749's cybernetic enhancements became instruments of torture as every implant in his body received contradictory signals simultaneously. His enhanced reflexes turned against him, causing muscle spasms that shattered his own bones. His tactical processors, overwhelmed by impossible data streams, initiated emergency shutdown protocols that left him conscious but completely paralyzed. 7 champions, 7 different species representing the pinnacle of galactic military evolution, all defeated by a single human who had turned their own biology into a weakness. The arena fell silent except for the groaning of stressed metal and the crackling of failing energy systems. Kira stood among the carnage, blood streaming from her nose and ears, her damaged neural implant sending constant waves of agony through her skull. But she was alive, and 23 of the galaxy's greatest warriors were not citizens of the hegemony. She called out, her voice somehow carrying across the arena despite the failing audio systems. You called my species weak, you thought. We would die quietly and beautifully for your entertainment. 3 million alien spectators sat in stunned silence, their assumptions about human frailty shattered along with their champions' corpses. You were wrong, Kira continued, swaying on her feet as neurological damage began shutting down her motor functions. We don't die beautifully. We don't die quietly. When you push us to extinction, we take as many of you with us as possible. The arena's main structural supports finally gave way, sending massive sections of the complex crashing down toward the combat floor. Kira looked up at the falling debris with something approaching satisfaction. She had accomplished her mission, not just survival, but demonstration. Humanity's message had been delivered with brutal clarity. They were not prey to be hunted, not entertainment to be consumed, not a species to be easily dismissed. They were survivors who would adapt to any environment, overcome any odds, and make their enemies pay a price that would haunt them across generations. As the debris fell toward her, Kira closed her eyes and waited for impact. Her work was done. The galaxy would remember this day and humanity's enemies would think twice before underestimating them again. The arena collapsed in a thunderous cascade of metal and stone, burying the combat floor under millions of tons of wreckage. But the message had already been transmitted across the galaxy, carried by the 3 million witnesses who had expected to see an execution, and instead witnessed something that would reshape their understanding of warfare itself. Humanity had announced its presence on the galactic stage not with diplomacy or negotiation, but with violence so precise and devastating that it redefined what smaller species could accomplish when pushed beyond their breaking point. The rescue excavation took 18 hours, and Warlord Rickstack had been certain they would find only human remains beneath the collapsed arena. Instead, they uncovered a survival bunker improvised from arena debris, hegemony power cells, and what appeared to be a life support system, cobbled together from 23 different alien technologies. Dr. Kira Voss was unconscious, but alive, her damaged neural implant finally having burned out completely during the collapse. The medical bay aboard the Crimson Harvest fell silent as hegemony physicians struggled to comprehend how a human had not only survived the arena's destruction, but had somehow anticipated it enough to prepare a refuge. She engineered her own survival while simultaneously executing 23 champions, reported Chief Medical Officer Yexlam, his tentacles writhing with scientific confusion. The mathematical precision required to calculate structural collapse patterns. While engaged in mortal combat, it defies cognitive modeling. Rickstack stared through the medical bay's viewing port at the unconscious human, his mandibles clicking nervously. 3 days had passed since the arena massacre, and the political ramifications were spreading throughout hegemony space like a virus. Betting syndicates had collapsed overnight, taking entire planetary economies with them. 7 species were demanding investigations into how their greatest champions had been defeated by what they had considered an inferior creature. More disturbing were the reports from hegemony intelligence services. Human resistance movements throughout occupied space had become exponentially more active since recordings of the arena match began circulating through illegal communication networks. The humans weren't just fighting back, they were fighting back with tactical innovations that suggested they had been studying their captors far more carefully than anyone had realized. "What are your orders regarding the human?" asked Arena Master Vex Dan, who had been reduced in rank but retained for his expertise in managing gladiatorial logistics. Rickstack considered his options carefully. Executing Kira would make her a martyr and likely increase human resistance activities. Releasing her would demonstrate weakness that other hegemony species might exploit. Studying her would provide valuable intelligence, but also acknowledge that humans possessed capabilities worthy of analysis. Transfer her to the deep research facility on Korthik Station, he finally decided. Full biological and neurological analysis. I want to understand how her species produces such tactical adaptation under extreme stress. What Rickstack didn't know was that Kira had been conscious for the last 6 hours, her damaged neural implant having burned out in a way that severed the hegemony's ability to monitor her brain activity while leaving her cognitive functions intact. She had heard every word of their planning discussions and was already formulating her next move. The transport to Korthik Station would take 14 days through hyperspace, 14 days, during which she would be confined with hegemony research personnel who had been studying human physiology for months. They considered themselves experts on human limitations and capabilities. They were about to discover how wrong they were. 6 months later, the Korthik Station research facility went dark when hegemony rescue ships arrived. They found the station's crew dead and its database completely purged. Dr. Kira Voss was gone, along with detailed intelligence files on 17 different alien species and the locations of every human prison facility in the sector. The escape triggered the largest manhunt in hegemony history, but by then it was too late. Human resistance cells throughout occupied space had received detailed tactical manuals on exploiting alien weaknesses, compiled by someone who had demonstrated the effectiveness of such knowledge in the most public way possible. The Kepler Rebellion began 3 weeks later, when human guerrillas used Vorthic neurotoxins against their own creators turning the aliens' enhanced nervous systems into vulnerabilities. The Threx incident followed, with human saboteurs triggering harmonic resonances that shattered crystalline Nexari command structures. Within 2 months, 17 different human resistance movements were using alien biology as weapons against their former captors. The hegemony's response was swift and brutal. Entire human colonies were sterilized from orbit, their populations executed as examples to discourage further resistance. But for every human killed, 10 more seemed to take their place, armed with knowledge that turned the galaxy's most advanced species into victims of their own evolution. Dr. Kira Voss became a legend whispered in the darkest corners of occupied space. Some claim she was dead, killed during her escape from Korthik Station. Others insisted she was leading a shadow war against the hegemony, training human resistance fighters. In the art of xenobiological warfare, intelligence reports placed her on 17 different worlds simultaneously, usually just after devastating attacks on alien military installations. The truth was both simpler and more complex than the legend. Kira had spent the months following her escape establishing a network of human scientists, soldiers, and survivors who shared her understanding of what needed to be done. Humanity couldn't win a conventional war against the hegemony. They lacked the numbers, the technology, and the industrial capacity. But they could make occupation so costly that the aliens would eventually abandon their conquered territories. The final phase of her plan activated exactly 1 year after the Arena Massacre. Simultaneous attacks on 43 different worlds, each targeting species-specific weaknesses that rendered conventional defenses useless. Vorthic enhancement centers poisoned by their own stimulants. Nexari power grids collapsed by harmonic interference. Threx breeding facilities sterilized by weaponized pheromones. The hegemony's military response was predictable and devastating. Orbital bombardments reduced human settlements to radioactive glass. Entire star systems were quarantined and their populations eliminated. The genocide was thorough, efficient, and ultimately self-defeating, because for every human world destroyed, the survivors carried Kira's knowledge to new systems. The techniques she had developed spread like a virus through the galaxy's underground networks, adapted and refined by people who had nothing left to lose. Humanity's diaspora became its strength, turning refugees into weapons and exile into opportunity. The war lasted 17 years and ended not with humanity's victory, but with the hegemony's exhaustion. The cost of maintaining control over species that could turn their own biology against them became unsustainable. Garrison forces required constant rotation to prevent xenobiological poisoning. Supply lines needed protection from attacks that could come from any direction using any technology. The final withdrawal began on the anniversary of the Arena Massacre. Hegemony forces abandoned their outermost territories first, then their secondary holdings, then their primary colonies. Each retreat was accompanied by scorched earth tactics, designed to deny resources to human resistance movements, but also by a growing recognition that humanity had fundamentally changed the nature of interstellar warfare. Dr. Kira Voss died at the age of 43, her nervous system finally succumbing to damage from the Arena's neural implant malfunction. She died in a laboratory on New Geneva, surrounded by the human scientists who had spent years documenting alien weaknesses and developing countermeasures against every known species in the galaxy. Her funeral was attended by representatives from 47 different human worlds, many of them colonies that had been founded by refugees from hegemony-occupied space. The eulogy was simple. She taught us that being human wasn't about being strong or fast or technologically advanced. It was about refusing to accept that anything was impossible. The memorial they built in her honor was not a monument or statue, but a library. The Voss archive contained every piece of xenobiological data that humanity had collected, organized, and weaponized during the war. It was freely accessible to any human who wanted to study it, and heavily encrypted against alien interception. The message inscribed above the archive's entrance read, "They called us weak. We proved them wrong. Never again." The galaxy had learned a fundamental truth about humanity during those 17 years of war. They were not the strongest species, Not the fastest, not the most technologically advanced, but they were the most adaptable, the most persistent, and the most willing to turn their enemies' strengths into weaknesses. More importantly, they were the only species that treated extinction as a problem to be solved rather than a fate to be accepted. The hegemony still controlled vast territories throughout the galaxy, but they no longer expanded into systems with human populations. The cost-benefit analysis was simple. Conquering humans was possible, but ruling them was not. The price of occupation would always exceed the value of the territories gained. And in the depths of space, on worlds where humans were building new lives free from alien domination, children learned about Dr. Kira Voss and the day she made an arena flood with screaming. They learned about the importance of studying their enemies, of turning disadvantage into advantages, of never accepting that survival was impossible. They learned what it meant to be human in a galaxy that had tried to prove them weak. The legend ended where it began, with a single human standing against impossible odds, refusing to die quietly for alien entertainment. But the truth was larger than any single person. Humanity had announced its presence on the galactic stage not as conquerors or diplomats, but as survivors who would make any enemy pay an unsustainable price for their aggression. They had been called weak. They had proven themselves to be something far more dangerous. They were human.